This lecture will be our first of three that gives a brief overview of Mesoamerica prior to contact with the Old World, or before the conquest by the Spanish. First, to give us a reminder of the region that we're talking about, this map shows most of what is considered Mesoamerica. Actually, different researchers kind of take different perspectives on what exactly counts as parts of Mesoamerica, but primarily we're talking about most of Mexico. Usually the most northern parts of Mexico are not included in the cultural region of Mesoamerica, and then also Central America. So we have Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador primarily included in this region. Now, this slide is not something that I expect you to necessarily have committed to memory completely, but it might be something that's useful for you to return to. The idea here is to give you a chronology, a consistent place where you can return and see the dates in question when I'm talking about periods of pre-Hispanic history. So beginning at the top, we have the first people who occupied Mesoamerica. As we'll see, the dates there are getting pushed back repeatedly, and it's likely that people have been there for longer than 12,000 years, and we have some intriguing new evidence for that. And then the Archaic period from 8,000 to 2,000 before the Common Era, or 10,000 to 4,000 years ago, is a time during which Mesoamericans developed a lot of domesticated foods. And then the formative period, we see this shorter roughly 2 millennium long period of time during which Mesoamericans established sedentary communities and developed increasing social complexity. And then during the Classic period, we have the establishment of major city-states in much of Mesoamerica. In the post-Classic, we see the collapse of some of those city-states, but the rise of others. And then at the end of the post-Classic, you'll notice that one specific year, 1519, at the end of the post-Classic, we have the arrival of the Spanish. In terms of the peopling of the Americas, there are actually some different theories for how the first people came to the Americas, and these theories have changed over time. This is actually a major area for the archaeology of the Americas. There's a lot of debate in this area. There's a lot of new evidence that continues to emerge in terms of linguistic evidence for initial occupation and interaction and migration after that occupation. There's new evidence in terms of genetic evidence. There's new human remains that are being found from time to time. The big picture here is that almost all the evidence, the genetic evidence, the linguistic evidence, much of the artifactual evidence, it all suggests that the first peoples of the Americas came from Asia. They came across either at some point an exposed land bridge, the Bering Land Bridge, known as a Beringia, when ocean levels were lower at the end of the last ice age, or it's increasingly accepted that the very first peoples actually probably came along the Pacific coast, moving in boats, leaving from Asia and then migrating along probably the edge of major glaciers that would have existed in the North Pacific, and then moving down the Pacific coast of the Americas in boats as they hunted for marine mammals and fished. So this would have been a maritime adapted population. There also is a small faction of archaeologists that believes that there's some evidence for what they call the Solutrean hypothesis, basically that some stone tool typology evidence suggests that maybe some of the first peoples in the Northeast actually could have come over from the area of Spain or France. That is not widely accepted. There's not the genetic evidence doesn't bear that out. The genetic evidence from modern Native American people and from the human remains that are discovered in archaeological sites all suggest that the ancestors of the Native Americans came from Asia. But nonetheless, this is a large hemisphere. There are different ways people could have arrived. So there's a possibility. It is true that off the coast of Florida, for example, there are some submerged, 14,000-year-old campsites that are kind of mysterious in terms of their location. In fact, one of the earliest sites that we'll discuss a little bit later is actually the site of Monteverde in southern Chile, which dates back to almost 15,000 years old. In fact, that site of Monteverde in southern Chile is really interesting in part because it was discovered in kind of a wetland, basically a bog type context in which some organic materials actually preserved in a much more complete fashion than they do in most archaeological contexts. And so for that reason, even though it dates back to almost 15,000 years old, we actually have good evidence of basically semi-permanent foundations for relatively robust tent structures, sort of a semi-permanent inhabitation here as opposed to just a simple ephemeral campsite. The preservation at Monteverde is pretty incredible, as you can see here with these archaeologists doing some excavation at the site. They actually find things like tent pegs, wooden tent pegs. They find evidence that suggests these people had fishing nets. And they also find something I think is very compelling, which is evidence for botanical remains or botanical samples that may have had medicinal qualities. Now that suggests that the people of Monteverde were not recent arrivals to southern Chile 15,000 years ago, but rather perhaps they had known their environment for generations. Now that suggests that we don't have the earliest site here. We have a site of people who know their region fairly well, which I think is really interesting. And that's kind of a general rule in archaeology. Whenever you discover something, you can almost be assured that you don't have the earliest example of it. Here are some sample artifacts from the site of Monteverde. It's not in question that these are human artifacts. We have things like probable net sinks that may have been used for fishing. We have bifacially flaked stone tools. We have things like the net, things like the tent pegs I mentioned to you, and some other carved stone and ground stone tools, for example. And taken as a whole, the assemblage of artifacts from this site all the way down in southern Chile suggests a group of people who would have been maritime adapted, who would have been good at boating down the coast, good at harvesting important resources, not only from the land with botanical remains, but also fishing and hunting of marine mammals for their subsistence. So this would tend to fit fairly well with the hypothesis that perhaps the first occupants of the Americas, going back to somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago, had arrived from Asia not by walking over the Bering Land Bridge, but rather by boating down the Pacific coast. In fact, the receding glaciers at the end of the last ice age would have revealed a pathway for humans to walk from Siberia across the Bering Land Bridge and into North America, probably after the site of Monteverde was actually occupied. So Monteverde dates back at least to roughly 15,000 years. There may actually be an earlier context that's not very much published. But the people who came across the Bering Land Bridge on foot, likely following large game animals that they were hunting, may not have done so until more like 10, 11, 12,000 years ago. So we have multiple avenues of migration from Asia into the New World. And the site of Monteverde, even though it's not in Mesoamerica, this is in South America, the site of Monteverde demonstrates that these people had already colonized much of the Pacific coast by almost 15,000 years ago. Now, in terms of evidence for early occupants of Mesoamerica itself, we actually have a recent discovery within the last few years of an actual individual human. A girl of about 16 years fell into a cave in the Yucatan Peninsula, basically like a limestone pit that she fell into, and over time that pit has become filled with water. It's an interesting protected environment where her bones were very well preserved, along with the skeletons of some extinct Pleistocene animals. I will post in the weekly module a link to a short film clip about the Hoyo Negro project, to reconstruct, for example, the skull of this early Mesoamerican who fell into this pit about 13,000 years ago. Now, we have some other evidence for early Mesoamerican occupation. For example, in central Mexico, at the edge of what was Lake Texcoco, which we will see later became the site of the Aztecs right before the arrival of the Spanish. Thousands of years before this, up to 11,000 to 9,000 years ago, or 9,000 to 7,000 before the Common Era, we have a site at the edge of Lake Texcoco known as Santa Isabel Ixtapan, and we have here imperial mammoths, large megafauna of the Pleistocene, huge animals that have since become extinct after the end of the last ice age, and not just the remains of the bones themselves, but actual evidence in terms of things like cut marks and stone tools for the butchering of these animals by human hunters. Now, as we will see in later periods of Mesoamerican occupation, the peoples of this part of the world shifted away from being hunter-gatherers to gradually incorporating more and more horticulture, sort of gardening of emerging domesticated plants, and then ultimately agriculture, or becoming reliant on domesticated plants. Now, Mesoamericans, as well as people in other parts of the ancient world, established some pretty ingenious technological approaches to how they practiced their ancient farming. A lot of this farming was done by slash and burn technology, which would allow the farmers to rotate their crops, leaving some of their areas fallow, and then use the process of burning the overbrush to basically sow nitrogen into the land. As populations grew and arable land became in higher and higher demand, some regions, such as in the Copan Valley, for example, in the Maya area, some people in some regions began to terrace their hillsides in order to increase the amount of land they could farm, basically by preserving the topsoil through making a series of steps up hillsides. And then, by the time of the Aztecs, late in pre-contact Mesoamerican history, we have the Aztecs doing some really incredible, complex multi-cropping and raised field or chinampa agriculture, where they would actually practice agriculture in wetland areas around Lake Texcoco, using the mud from the wetland itself as a very nitrogen-rich fertile planting substrate, and then they would multi-crop by planting a combination of things like corn and beans and squash in order to keep that system more self-sustaining. So, for example, corn to grow, or maize as we will often call it in this class, that takes nitrogen out of the soil, but beans actually put nitrogen in the soil. They're considered a nitrogen fixer, and squashes, as sort of a viney plant that grows across the ground itself, actually tend to help hold the raised field mounds together in a physical, structural sense. So growing these three crops together and then raising fish in the water canals actually allowed the Aztecs to do some really incredible, complex agriculture in a small area that we could stand to learn from today. We tend to, in our society, do monocropping, which is actually really terrible for the environment. We do a lot of plowing that kills the topsoil. The Aztecs, in some interesting ways, by doing things like fertilizing their crops with their own human waste, they were actually doing some pretty forward-thinking agriculture that has since been essentially wiped out, essentially destroyed after the conquest. Now, interestingly, if you go to Mexico City today, you can actually see the remains of some of the chinampas that are still around in a region, a neighborhood of Mexico City called Xochimilco, which is basically a modified version of the Aztec word for the place of the flowers. It's where they grow flowers in Mexico City. And you could go visit that today and actually move around in boats, almost like in Venice. Now, the Mesoamerican Archaic period, which dates to about 8,000 to 2,000 before the Common Era, or roughly 10,000 to 4,000 years ago, was a time during which most Mesoamericans were still mobile hunters and gatherers, and they increasingly began to experiment with plant domestication. We're actually not sure how this was accomplished in some ways, but we do know now with genetic studies, for example, that the most important crop of Mesoamerica, modern corn or maize, is a descendant of a wild grass known as teosinte, or a word basically modified from an Aztec word for sort of like plant of the gods or grass of the gods. Now, teosinte being modified and domesticated into modern corn is an incredible accomplishment that has taken about 9,000 years to complete. So something that actually is out of date in your textbook is their chronology for the domestication of maize is too conservative. Current genetic evidence suggests that maize has been a domesticated crop, something the Mesoamericans were experimenting with since as far back as about 7,000 before the Common Era, or 7,000 BC. So that 9,000 years of domestication of maize has produced a remarkable plant that's really different from its wild ancestor. It looks nothing like it. You can see here in this comparison, using a quarter for scale, just how exaggerated and accentuated the fruiting part of the modern maize plant is. Maize is the number one domesticate on Earth now, so if you ever had a doubt about the importance of Mesoamerican society, that fact alone is almost enough to demonstrate the importance of Mesoamerica, I think. The number one crop on Earth, used for everything from fuel to feeding livestock to delicious tortillas and so forth for our tacos and to tamales, for example. All the way to high fructose corn syrup put in our soda pop. This is a crop that is the number one crop in the world, and it's almost been genetically engineered. It's an incredible example of really scientific level experimenting that the ancient Mesoamericans must have undertaken. For example, there's a process known as nixtamalization, whereby ancient and modern agriculturalists in Mesoamerica combine a little bit of lime powder with their ground corn, and this actually helps make the corn a more complete food. I think it releases some special enzymes, or makes it a complete protein or something like that. It makes this a much more healthy food, and that's something that it really incredible example of what must have taken basically scientific experimenting thousands of years ago. We can actually see the process of maize domestication archaeologically, not just through genetic studies, not just through the study of microscopic plant remains such as pollen and phytoliths and starch grains and so forth, but even with the ground stone technology that was used to process the maize flour itself. So things like mortars and pestles, or molcajetes as they're known in Mexico, or manos and metates, which are the Spanish word for hand, and then the Aztec word for like a platform of grinding. These are stone tool technologies that were used to produce maize flour, and we can see them increasing in size as Mesoamericans spent more time experimenting with maize during the Archaic period, and then becoming large non-portable manos and metates at about the time people became sedentary. So in terms of early sedentary communities in Mesoamerica, what we start to see beginning roughly 4,000 years ago in Mesoamerica is an increase in the archaeological signature for early village societies. People are starting to establish villages. They're settling down from their mobile horticultural and hunting and gathering lifeways into the first villages. This is actually the specific aspect of Mesoamerican history that I focus on in my own research. My dissertation project and subsequent research has largely focused on the site of La Consentida, which you can see here on the map, which is on the Pacific coast of Oaxaca, the state of Oaxaca in southern Mexico. And La Consentida, in some really interesting ways, it's a very early site, but one of the kind of cool things about it is it's not necessarily a super unique example. Rather, it is a sample of one of these early villages where people are first settling down in Mesoamerica. Now, at sites like La Consentida, which represent early formative period history, we see, as I mentioned, the emergence of villages. We see one of the technological features that comes along with this process is the adoption of ceramic technologies, perhaps introduced from Central America or Northern South America, or perhaps both. The use of ceramics for things like making vessels that were used for cooking and storage, but also making things like small-scale ceramic figurines, musical instruments, and so forth. We also see the establishment of early cemeteries and the offerings left with human remains in those cemeteries, likely representing growing social inequality as some people began to be born with their social status. On this map here, you can see the location of La Consentida in coastal Oaxaca, and on the map here, the site is surrounded by more recent sites around it. So La Consentida is the earliest known site in this region, and then over time we have more and more evidence of village societies emerging during the roughly 2,000 years of the formative period. Now, during our excavations in coastal Oaxaca at the site of La Consentida, we found some evidence of early households. These are structures that were quite ephemeral. This is about 4,000 years ago, and after 4,000 years in the coastal Oaxacan jungle, when your house had a dirt floor and a grass roof and walls made out of woven sticks, perhaps plastered over with mud, there's just not a lot left of a house like that. So we actually identified these structures in part through the nitrogen-rich organic stains that represent the floors. And then in excavating around the edges, we actually found the holes of the posts that held up the roof. One of the major things we recovered at La Consentida is the pottery. The pottery we find here is low-fired. It's early ceramic technology. They weren't using kilns. They were firing this in open pits, basically. So it's very fragile. It breaks easily. It's crumbly. It's sandy. And reconstructing it is a really difficult process. It's kind of like putting together a jigsaw puzzle when somebody has sanded all the edges and thrown away half the pieces. But the idea here is I was trying to reconstruct enough of these vessels to get a good idea of the vessel form, so that I could understand the assemblage of ceramics that they had available to them. There were also a few complete examples of smaller vessels. These were usually found with human burials. Now, when the entire assemblage is reconstructed, we see that the potters of La Consentida had a pretty diverse set of ceramic vessels that they could use for different purposes, for everything from grinding corn and other foods, beans, for example, to cooking and perhaps storing water. Some of these bottles may have held some kind of beverage, perhaps even something fermented like some kind of beer. They may have had chocolate. We're not sure about that yet. Some of their vessels were small and decorated and beautiful. Others were much more chunky and utilitarian, used for cooking and so forth. But here's an idea of a reconstructed version of the total assemblage. The other major technology that these people had available that preserves archaeologically, obviously we lose a lot of organic material, but their stone tools are well preserved. So we have good examples of the volcanic glass or obsidian that they were using for the very sharp stone tools. Obsidian is interesting because we can actually source it chemically using a study called X-ray fluorescence. So we can actually find a good idea of the interaction networks used by the people of La Consentida. And then for other kinds of tasks that required a tougher type of stone that's less brittle, they would use things like chert or flint or quartzite or chalcedony to make things like these interesting drills. They were drilling something, some kind of crafting practice that we don't understand yet. We've also been able to use some new technologies such as sonication, using sound waves, to shake tiny preserved particles of plant remains out of some of these ceramic and stone tools. And through that process, we've identified some evidence for wild beans, evidence for domesticated maize, and so forth. In some cases, in vessels that were actually later deposited as burial offerings with human burials. So these vessels had complex use lives. The people of early Mesoamerican villages like La Consentida also had complex ritual lives, and ritual practitioners, who some researchers have called shamans, also were leaving behind special artifacts and toolkits that they used as part of their religious practices. We found, for example, at La Consentida, a ritual cache near some human burials that included the complete skeleton of a rare venomous reptile similar to a Gila monster, along with a fossilized shark tooth that was very sharp and perhaps used for a bloodletting ritual as part of auto-sacrifice that we'll discuss more in subsequent lectures. And then one of Mesoamerica's earliest ceramic musical instruments, a bird ocarina, that still plays. And in fact, I will leave a link in the weekly module so that you can hear the sound of this instrument. As part of my own research on the ceramic iconography, or the small-scale ceramic figurines and musical instruments from early Mesoamerica, I produce photogrammetric models, which are 3D digital models that you can make with many photographs stitched together in a computer program that allow you to make a digital model that can actually be printed out in 3D or shown on a website. And as I mentioned, I will put a link to these models in the weekly module. If you've taken my other Mesoamerican archaeology class, you've likely seen these before. So the early villages of Mesoamerica were widespread. They had there was a lot of evidence of early villages both in the coasts and in the highlands of Mesoamerica. They were beginning to become more reliant on agriculture. They were beginning to show some signs for social complexity. And then in the Soconusco, which is the Pacific coastal region of Chiapas and Guatemala, at about 1600 before the Common Era, or about 3,600 years ago, we see the emergence of something a little different. We see the first probable chiefdoms in Mesoamerica. Chiefdoms are societies in which people are born into a special class of basically nobility, people who are going to become rulers in their society, no longer just achieve that status in their own life, but they're actually ascribed that status at birth. So we see the emergence in the Soconusco at this time of villages of 1,000 people or more, public buildings, monumental architecture such as earthen platforms and so forth. And we also see, now this is some other early ceramics in Mesoamerica, and in the Soconusco the pottery doesn't appear to have been used for cooking, but rather it was highly decorated and probably used to serve special foods at feasts. This would tend to suggest that public events and feasting were part of the establishment, part of the emergence of social complexity in this time and place. Now, in the subsequent centuries of the early formative period, things in the Soconusco sort of quiet down. Some of those early villages kind of fall apart and become less densely occupied. And the spark of social complexity, whatever that spark was, whether it came through interaction, whether it came through some kind of ideological beliefs and practices, seems to have sort of jumped across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, or the narrow band of land in southern Mexico. And we see the emergence of more highly developed and more organized chiefly societies in the famous Mesoamerican group known as the Olmec. So the Olmec are known for producing these colossal heads like the one you can see here, some of which were up to the size of Volkswagens. They also made special pottery and special carved greenstone artifacts and so forth, some of which actually came to influence other parts of Mesoamerica. Now, the Olmec heartland in the Gulf coastal region of Mexico, you can see here in the larger regional map in the lower left what I'm talking about. The Olmec is this group would be on the other side of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec from what we were just discussing in the Soconusco. And then in the blown up map you can see the major sites of the Olmec region. And we'll talk more in this lecture and in this class about San Lorenzo and La Venta, considered sort of the two major early Olmec capitals. The term capital may be not quite appropriate here. This isn't like a state-level society that appears to have all been organized into one entity, but rather probably chiefly centers where first we have the emergence of complexity at San Lorenzo, where most of those carved heads appear, and then as San Lorenzo sort of falls from its greatest heights, the kind of regional power shifts to the site of La Venta, which is more known for its monumental architecture. Here at the site of San Lorenzo, we can see some excavations from about the 1950s, where you've got evidence for monumental architecture, the building of platforms that would have been used for public gatherings and public ritual practices rather than for individual households. This is even more true at the site of Levento, the sort of second Olmec capital. Here in these excavations in the mid-20th century, you can see the remains of an earthen pyramid, basically, a large structure that probably contained burials and offerings, and that was part of a whole complex of public buildings. In fact, reconstructions of the Civic Ceremonial Center at La Venta suggest that it was well organized and laid out, probably according to cardinal directions and astronomical features. And in fact, it's been suggested that the main earthen pyramid at La Venta, that you can see here on the right, may have been built to represent a volcano. I think this is really telling. Volcanoes, bodies of water, caves, and so forth were all really important in the belief structure of ancient Mesoamericans. In fact, they continue to be important in the belief structure of modern native Mesoamericans today. And the fact that so much effort was undertaken on the part of hundreds of laborers to build this potential sort of model of a volcano, I think is very indicative of the significance of these features of the natural landscape as they were incorporated into the artificial landscape. La Venta is also famous for some really interesting finds that would have been invisible to the people who lived and worked there. So for example, this famous jaguar mask serpentine pavement from La Venta, it's also been interpreted that it may, rather than the face of a jaguar, it may represent the Ceiba earth tree, the sort of the world tree that became famous among the Maya, sort of a tree that held together the levels of existence in the universe, according to Mesoamerican belief. This pavement of serpentine stones was actually buried intentionally at its production. At the base of one of these earthen pyramids, they dug down the ancient Olmecs, they dug down, they built this elaborate serpentine sort of mosaic, and then they covered it up and perhaps marked it somehow on the surface. Now, in a really similar but much smaller find, I think this is very interesting. At the site of La Venta, it was discovered that there was a small cache of stone figurines, most of them some kind of green stone like a jadeite, all surrounding a central figurine carved out of sandstone, a much softer, easier to work stone. Now, these figurines appear to almost be having like a meeting. It's almost as though these are nobles or perhaps even spirits somehow communing. Also, they're standing in front of these tabular flat stones that seem to be similar to some large basalt stelae that were actually present at the site. So this may serve as kind of a model for how social interaction was undertaken at this important center. But this cache of figurines was actually intentionally buried in ancient times. The ancient Olmecs dug down into the ground, they put down this cache of figurines, they filled it back in, and when the archaeologists discovered this, they were actually able to see, if you look in the upper right there, they were actually able to see in the stratigraphy of the sediment above these figurines that people would later come, dig down to the figurines, uncover them, and we don't know what, move them around, just look at them, replace them with something, we're not sure, and then rebury them again. So somehow either people knew exactly where they were because they remembered and it was an important central spot, or they knew exactly where they were because they were marked on the surface or something. But this is a really interesting practice of kind of deliberately interring something in the earth that was undertaken by the Olmecs. The Olmecs have some other really interesting features in terms of their social organization. These basalt tombs at the site of La Venta, in some cases, actually contained the remains of juveniles with lots of offerings. That would suggest that these were people who were born with their social status rather than having earned it through their own lifetime. So this is a good piece of evidence for a chiefly society. And then we have elements of architecture and even sort of furniture, such as this monumental stone throne that seems to show a human, perhaps serving as some kind of a shaman or a ritual practitioner. This has been interpreted as a ruler who's also kind of like a priest king who is sitting half in and half out of the underworld. Now, if you notice, the underworld is actually the mouth of a great beast. There's a snout, there are nostrils and teeth above the cave. So if this is all part of a single sort of scene here, we have perhaps the world monster, the kind of living earth that's kind of a monster with a cave at its mouth. And the ruler's role is to sit sort of part in and part out with one foot on each side of this sort of divide in reality, and to serve as an intermediary perhaps between the living and the dead. More evidence for this transformational role of the leaders of the ancient Olmec can be found in the small-scale iconography, such as masks and small jadeite carvings that show rulers transforming into jaguars. These have been called were-jaguars, basically like a werewolf, and they serve as an example of a broader Mesoamerican belief that's discussed in your textbook, where even modern Mesoamerican peoples still talk about close links between the human and the animal. They don't really see the divide between human and animal reality the way Western cultures tend to do. And so there are stories during the early colonial period, for example, of community leaders in indigenous towns who claimed to be able to transform into jaguars or buzzards or other powerful animals. And we can see that in the Olmec art. Now, how did the Olmec believe they could transform? It may have been in part through hallucination. Bufo marinus is a toad that produces a toxic secretion from its skin, and many of these bones of Bufo marinus have been found in the tombs and so forth of Olmec sites. So it's suggested, we're not sure, that perhaps these animals were consumed or somehow even smoked. Their skin may have been smoked in order to produce hallucinations that would have been part of this transformational belief system. We also have evidence of bloodletting, where a ritual practitioner would let their own blood for some kind of divination. And then we have some other mysterious aspects of Olmec culture, such as the hollow babies that do suggest some kind of importance of children, or at least spirits who look like children. These are actually found all over Mesoamerica. And the site of El Manatee, an important early Olmec site located near one of these freshwater sinkholes or cenotes, actually has evidence of human remains of children who may have been sacrificed. So it appears that these children were a part of Olmec belief in some way. We're not quite sure what they meant. And then as we round out our first lecture on pre-contact Mesoamerica, I just want to briefly touch on something that we see evidence emerging of in the formative period, and it perhaps dates even as far back as the Archaic period, and that is shared calendars in the Mesoamerican tradition. Now, Mesoamerican societies typically used two calendars. They had a calendar similar to our own, a solar calendar of about 365 days. Mesoamericans tended to count in base 20, probably based on the number of fingers and toes on at least most human bodies. And so they would have 18 months of 20 days each. And then there was a short time of ritual danger of 5 months in order to round out the calendar. So that's the solar calendar, and they could base that on the movement of the sun as we had longer and shorter days throughout the year. But then they also had a ritual calendar of only 260 days. Now, we have different interpretations for what this may mean, but the one that I think is most compelling is that it may refer to the length of the time to gestate a human baby. So I think this is really interesting in terms of Mesoamerican worldviews. They had on the one hand a calendar that looked outward at the universe itself, at the movement of the sun and celestial bodies and so forth, the solar calendar. And then they had another calendar that looked inward at the human body, at the length of time to gestate a baby. And in fact, these two calendars worked together so that specific rituals, such as the new fire ceremony that would be undertaken every 52 years by the Maya and the Aztecs when the Spanish arrives, those would take place every 52 years because that was when the two calendars sort of met back up again and the process began again. So I use the image that you can see here in the lower right because it kind of shows the way the solar calendars and the ritual calendars kind of work together, almost like basically like gears in a watch or cogs in a machine. Now the calendar system appears to also have been not only kind of the basis for ritual practice in Mesoamerica, but probably also the basis for some of the writing traditions in Mesoamerica. And we will discuss some of this stuff more in the next lectures.